Hi everyone. Firstly, if you are new to the channel, welcome. Thank you for dropping by. If you like this sort of content that you see, please do subscribe. I tend to cover geopolitics, current affairs, sociopolitics. Those tend to be my go-to, but I cover other things as well. Very occasionally, I do a film review. I talk about semi-philosophical things, and yeah, cover a range of things. But that would be the overall theme of my channel. I want to talk about a particular issue that I have brought up on this channel. But brief words about live streams. So, to subscribers who turned up at my live stream last night, thank you. I think that was a good live stream. Apologies, I had to cut it off a little bit short. But basically, if you haven't been to my live streams before, I kind of there's nothing flashy or special about them, but it's just an opportunity for me to engage with subscribers because I can't always guarantee that I'll get back to every comment. Although, people are free to leave comments. I try to get back to them, but with the live stream, it's a direct way of engaging with people. So if you do turn up to that, then what you could do is leave a question, ask my thoughts on something, share your own thoughts on something. It's just a way to get a dialogue going, basically. Um, it could be absolutely anything. Um, and for the most part, I find live streams I enjoy it. I think it's a good way of engaging with subscribers. I do them periodically simply because if I were to have a set time, um, firstly, my own lifestyle, I just don't have I'm doing something different every day, so I can't really, I don't have the discipline to have a set time in that sense. But I also find that by having it a little bit sporadic, it gives opportunities for everyone because people have different time scales. And I have subscribers outside the UK, so it's to allow for American subscribers, Turkish subscribers, people in other countries as well, factoring in the different time zones. So, yeah, please do feel welcome to turn up at my live streams. Um, I don't advertise them for the reason I said, so you may miss one, but I do them periodically, roughly once a month. So, yeah, that's what that's for. Now, I mentioned that this is about something I've covered before. So, woke ideology is issue at hand. But before talking about that, it's worth talking a little bit about what's termed the culture wars. Because I think it's fair to say in the 21st century, the old left right battles have switched somewhat. Left right battles used to be things like debates around labour laws, employee rights, big government, that sort of thing, Um, and there were particular interests that both sides had. So the left would traditionally be interested in things like unions and the unionization unions, workers' rights, that sort of thing. The right would be interested in, as the name suggests, conserving traditions, that sort of thing. But what we found in the 21st century is it's also crossed into the social sphere in a way that wasn't as relevant before. I think, to be fair, I think there's always been elements of it there. There's always been elements of culture wars in politics. I mean, the very nature of politics is adversarial, so there's always been ground for differences of opinion um, as to how society is going. But I think the differences in the 21st century, it's become tribalized in a way that wasn't the same before. I think it would be naive to say, I think sometimes we look at politics and political discourses, or, once upon a time it was all civil and nice. I think politics is always adversarial, always. Um, I was watching a documentary last night on the late Brian Mulroney, the Canadian Prime Minister in the 1980s, and some of the cutthroat things that was going on in his day was quite something, but it wasn't culture wars in the same way. Um, it's an interesting documentary if you get a chance to watch it. It's just called Brian Mulroney, Triumph and Treachery. So it's an interesting documentary. I was thinking about Canadian politics last night, actually, with the resignation of Trudeau. Um, But let's look at this word woke now, because with the culture wars, I think that what they've tapped into is when we think of the culture wars, and I'm not even sure if that's the best term for it, it taps into, for example, word regulation. What words are appropriate, what words aren't appropriate, what's deemed to be offensive, what's deemed to not be offensive. And both sides play this game, quite honestly. Now, it leaves me thinking, where do we lie at this point? Because I'm almost tempted to say we're past it. I don't think we are. I think these debates are still going to go on. We're still going to see headlines about people being dismissed for trivial reasons, or we're going to see, debates around pronouns and numerous other things. And I'll go into more detail later in the video about what I perceive this to be. But we're still going to see that, but the reason I say I think we're almost past it is I wonder, well, we've had these big social movements. We had Me Too. We had Oscar So White a few years ago. We've had Black Lives Matter, which I do think they hit their peak in 2020. I think they've lost a lot of influence now, which in my opinion is a good thing. Which I think with Black Lives Matter, and this is true of other movements, they start off with some reasonable contentions. That is to say, there is some ground to this. There is definitely some cause here. But the problem with social movements like Black Lives Matter, and I think to some extent Me Too, although I would argue it's a bit more relevant at the moment, and I'll quantify that in a second. But I think with Black Lives Matter, for instance, they had legitimate issues about police brutality and accountability, and I do think they served a role in bringing about that debate. I do think there's a problem in America with police accountability, but the problem with Black Lives Matter is instead of just saying, "Look, we're a civil rights organization calling for police accountability," they just morphed into a sort of black supremacist organization. When I say organization, it's very loose because there isn't a single, there's various, it's more like a movement than a single organization. They had blatant racism in their midst, they had blatant anti white racism. And I've always said, you cannot cherry pick bigotry. You cannot say, I'm against bigotry or some form of prejudice, but I'm going to, be okay with another form. You cannot say, look, I'm an anti-racist campaigner, but I'm going to trivialize anti-white racism. Oh, that's fine because it's white people. No, that is just those sort of double standards really grain on people, and there's unquestionably racists within Black Lives Matter who are basically black supremacists. And that's why I, if I had any sympathy towards it, I certainly that trailed away. I also think it was a mistake to say that only the far right say all lives matter. All lives matter as a concept is just about as most egalitarian and fair as you can get. It's literally saying everyone is equal. It's literally saying everyone matters. Um, so I think the hysterical reaction to that was not helpful. I don't care that some um, possibly far right groups used it. The principle of it, all lives matter. You literally, how could you argue against that? I don't understand how anyone could argue against that principle. Um, why, for example, would a white victim of police brutality matter less? It's that's something that I think yeah, is highly contentious to this idea that that was somehow an offensive statement when it is literally the most egalitarian statement you could think of. I didn't make a video about it, so I'll just quickly reference it. In New Zealand recently, there was a controversy because an opposition politician whose name eludes me now, I was following the story at the time, but a few weeks back now. Anyway, he proposed changing the constitution to allow for um, editing of equality laws to make all New Zealanders equal in law, whereas it stands over a historic treaty, the Maori community has particular rights um, set out in law due to that treaty with the Crown in the 1850s, I believe it was. But the controversy was that this opposition politician was accused of, and I apologize, I really have a brain freeze regarding his name. But there was a famous thing that happened in the Parliament, infamous maybe, where a Maori lady, she actually got up and performed the haka right in Parliament. And I just thought, okay, that's great for headline grabbing, and it was. It got headlines all over the world, but it's not a debate, and actually it is just trying to shout the other side down. Literally, the haka is a war dance. So I wasn't impressed by that as a political move to sort of, instead of actually coming up with an argument as to why he was wrong, she just thought, we'll intimidate him. It's literally the haka is a war dance. It's a defiant war dance. So I do think that was highly inappropriate for Parliament basically to shut down the other side in that way. And I do recall the guy had, I mean, I'm not saying I agree with him because I don't know enough about the details, but he did make a fair point. He said, reasoned debate versus bullying people into silence. He was contrasting the two approaches. Most New Zealanders, well, I got the impression New Zealanders were divided on this. There were large protests against the proposed bill and in favour of the Maori, but I don't know. Was an example of, I think, the culture wars in New Zealand. But that's, I'm just making that point to show that it's something that still can be hot topic. But why did I say I think we're almost past it? Because Donald Trump's got re-elected. Okay, he's as Trumpian as he ever was. Just for the record, I think he's an utterly obnoxious figure. I do not unsay anything I've said about Donald Trump. He is a liar. He is a demagogue, and I do think he's an unstable figure. I do, and I just find it thoroughly depressing this sort of personality cult that is around him and around Elon Musk. Um, it's a shit show, to be quite honest, and in my view, it's thoroughly depressing. But woke. If we look at this term woke specifically, it's worth analysing a bit because what we've seen in the last, say, 5, 6, 7 years is a debate over the term itself. Now, I will say right now, I do think the left look a bit foolish by getting defensive regarding the term. And the reason I say that is because it's the left that coined the term in the first place. As we understand it, the term originated in about the 70s from the African American community as a way of being, as they saw, awoken to injustice, and it kind of coincided with the Black Panther movement and so on. That sort of black identitarianism in the 1970s. That's where the term originates. It kind of came up again, I would say, in the late 2010s, roughly speaking. It's difficult to pinpoint this, but I would say it became popular vernacular roughly around 2017, 2018. Very roughly speaking, maybe 2016. Um, but what happened was it kind of got adopted by the regressive left. And I came across a guy on Twitter, a black guy, who made this point. He said, look, this was the origins of woke, and now the rights are hijacking it. He actually claimed the right was hijacking it, and that's why we have to stop using the term. I would argue it's a regressive left hijacked it if it was indeed hijacked. Because they took it as a catch-all for being progressive. So, for instance, if you believed, as they would, that there are over 50 genders, then you're woke. And it was actually seen as a positive adjective. Oh, I'm woke. Progressive people would boast about being woke because they would see it as a positive thing. They would see it as a sort of hallmark of being open-minded and compassionate and progressive. I actually don't think it is that at all. And it's one of the main reasons I abhor woke thinking. But that's how they saw it. But what happened was as the right started to push back, as the right started to ridicule it and criticize its excesses, then the left got defensive. So it's kind of, the word has kind of been used as a bit of a political football to the point where it almost is meaningless now. I've used it myself, and I make no apology for that. I think it's a bit rich of the left to complain about the word being used when they are the ones who invented it in the first place. Um, well, rather the African American left did. Then it was brought up in the late 2010s by white liberal students and so on. Although I would argue actually their approach hasn't been that liberal. Um, so where do we go with this term? You may have noticed I've been using it less in my videos just because of this reason. I just think it's been thrown around a lot. But this doesn't mean that I agree with the left that it's misused. I do think there are excesses with woke thinking. What I find rather tiresome is when I see left wing people, and I've seen this, they've written in the newspapers, they said, I always thought woke was about being compassionate, but the right seem to think it's an insult. I would invite those people to consider why it's become controversial. It's not just the right that's criticised it, centrists have criticised it as well. The reason being is that woke ideology nowadays is not about being open minded and compassionate, it's about being rather draconian, actually. For instance, literally looking for reasons to be offended. I think, how can we describe woke ideology as it pertains to, the last few years? I think people see it, I mean, that is conservatives and centrists like myself. I would even argue some centre left people recognize this. They see it as being shackling, as being petty, as being hypocritical, basically not what it claims to be. So, when I see woke people, I don't see compassionate, open minded people. I see busybodies who go around trying to find reasons to be offended. And that's a very toxic thing when you combine hypersensitivity with simultaneously, wrapping yourself in a victimhood narrative. It's very toxic. I'll cite one recent example actually. There was a Canadian version of Dragon's Den. It might have been The Apprentice. I'm not sure what the exact term was, but they had a thing with boba tea, right? And this white couple were promoting it. Now I understand their sales pitch wasn't great and their body language wasn't great. Maybe they could have done it better. Fair enough. But one of the judges criticized them for cultural appropriation, and that opened up a whole can of worms. Because on one hand, you had people criticizing him for using that term, and it's not a term I like. But then I noticed there was one Asian American group. I think it was ABC Asia. Something. Regardless, it was a group pitching towards Asian Americans and Asian Canadians, and they were really going after this couple. How dare they, you know, try to appropriate our boba tea? And I just thought the whole thing was nonsense. I mean, that would be an example of extreme wokeism, extreme hypersensitivity. I don't like the term cultural appropriation because it essentially says only one ethnic group is allowed to enjoy something. Only one ethnic group can be. Um, it's absurd. It really is absurd because in a globalized world, like it or not, we are interconnected. It's impossible not to be. I mean, if you're using a computer, chances are it was made in China or Taiwan, components at least. Probably with a manufacturing factory in the United States, and then when the components are brought in, chances are you'll be eating food from another part of the world. Chances are you'll be driving a car from another part of the world. The point I'm making here is because of the globalized nature of the world, we all culturally appropriate to some extent. And the irony with that term, and the reason I really don't like it, is because it's essentially saying that, if you basically show an interest in other cultures and you respect other cultures, you somehow being bigoted. And yet, if you didn't, they'd say you're being close minded and parochial. This is the problem with woke people. It's like walking on eggshells with them. And I don't know if they can see how they come across. I don't know if they can see themselves how difficult they are to communicate with. Because you're talking to them and it's like they've got a little radar, like they're looking for reasons to be offended. It's utterly pathetic. Um, so that sort of hypersensitivity, I really have a big problem with. Um, so when we think of woke terms, I've mentioned the cultural appropriation thing. I think that is very overused. Microaggressions. I mean, what the hell is a microaggression? Someone saying something that's perhaps a little bit thoughtless or a little bit, not listening to what the other person's saying. Well, just correct them. Really, this idea of microaggressions, like someone is maliciously trying to, provoke you. It's just, to me, that is just being hypersensitive. Um, and then we get into other terms, coming from particular movements. Mansplaining, it's a term, that's come from feminists. Basically, ostensibly, it's about men being patronizing, but I think it is used as a catch-all when a man and a woman are in a debate, and the woman just doesn't like the fact that she's being challenged. Also, she'll use the term mansplaining. How dare you have a different opinion than me? Um, and there's others, white privilege. That's an utterly obnoxious term. I loathe that term because I'm aware of the context. It's talking about historic institutional racism, which was a reality. Let's be honest about it. It was. But the problem with the term in today's context is it disregards individuals' lived experience. So woke people always talk about how they care about lived experience, and yet they disregard that when they use generalizing terms like white privilege. So a poor white person who may have experienced homelessness, no, they shouldn't complain about it because they're actually privileged. I have argued with people who, with a straight face, have tried to tell me that a black homeless person has it worse than a white homeless person. They're homeless. It's shit for anyone in that situation. I mean, that really, frankly, it pissed me off because it's just lumping someone as a group. I mean, you couldn't get any less open minded than that, just tarring someone by the group. And it wouldn't stand with any other group, it goes without saying. You couldn't say that about, all black people or all Asian people. It's just a lazy generalizing, and by extension, I would argue, almost dehumanizing term. Almost. So I abhor that term. Critical race theory, I think, has a lot to answer for because it essentially teaches children that if you're a minority, you're a perpetual victim, and if you're white, you're a perpetual oppressor. That is a toxic message to send out to children. So, all of those things is why I really abhor woke thinking. None of that's anything to do with compassion. None of that is anything to do with being open minded. It is about micromanaging language. I haven't even mentioned the pronoun policing that you get with the trans lobby. I mean, these are things that are empirically happening. This isn't hot air, but sometimes we say, oh, the right is exaggerating this. And the Daily Mail will run reports of this. Now, I don't like the Daily Mail. I don't like their editorial stances often, but it has to be said they will cover this stuff in a way that other papers won't. It is absurd if a hospital has a sign saying, expectant people instead of expectant mothers. Those sort of things are nonsense. And the thing is, this isn't just about annoying language changes. It gets into real consequences when people actually are threatened with job loss. Where people are mandated to go in a critical race theory course as part of their job, when basically, if they're white, they're shamed. It's absolute nonsense. And if they refuse to do it, they could end up losing their position in the company that they work for. This sort of stuff is absolute nonsense. It should be challenged. It should be exposed. But there is a caveat. Apologies, I didn't mean to rant, but I want to just underline I do not like woke thinking, and that is why. Because I do think it's shackling, and I do think that it's very restrictive. Now, I mentioned there's a caveat. The caveat is this. I do think sometimes, just like they did with political correctness, I think the right will throw the term around a little bit when they're challenged. So, for instance, you might see a report about bullying, and you'll see right wingers come out and say, "Oh, it's just banter" or something like that. And they will throw the term woke around. And sometimes I see that term used, like, for example, there'll be a report about climate change, and then the right wingers will say, "Oh, they're just trying to be woke." Well, no, that's not necessarily. I mean, it's woke if it's blatant virtue signaling, for example, whereby a company or an individual is being excessively just trying to show green credentials that aren't really there anyway or something, just pander to the eco lobby, that may be deemed to be woke. I don't think recognizing climate change is woke. I don't think that recognizing there is problems of racism is woke. I don't think that recognizing the problem of sexual harassment is woke. I mentioned the Me Too thing. I do think it's relevant when you look at what happened in France with Giselle Pelicot. Um, so I want to be very clear that I don't absolutely dismiss issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, those sort of problems. Rather, it's the way that people approach them is the issue. So, with the right, what they've done, what some of them have done, I should say, is kind of go to the other extreme and just totally dismiss everything and say there is no racism, there's no sexism, there's no problems. Now, that's fantasy land. There clearly is problems in society. So when you get someone like Donald Trump Jr. or Elon Musk spouting off and just trivializing these things, um, I actually saw a report this evening from the Daily Mail about a teacher who was actually, she called a student ugly to their face. Now, that to me is not banter. That is extremely unprofessional. It just, I think the right don't do themselves any favors, in seeking to expose the woke left for being intolerant. Sometimes they just come across as heartless. I mean, if you're going to call actual examples of bullying banter, then you're not doing yourself any favors. So, as I see it from a center perspective, I do not like woke thinking. I do not like left wing mini totalitarians who go around trying to find microaggressions, trying to find reasons to sue their boss over nothing, um, and make people feel like they have to walk on eggshells. That is clearly nonsense. Or where an innocent comment about, for example, um, or where do you come from originally? That would be deemed to be some sinister racist thing. It's that sort of stuff is just nonsense, in my opinion. But where I do draw a line is where people are actually being obnoxious and where right wingers defend them as it's just banter or something. No, treat people with respect. Don't treat people in that demeaning way. If someone feels uncomfortable in a place of work, if they feel like they're being picked on, that can be a very unpleasant environment. No one should have to go through that. Of course, the irony is when the woke mob hound people out of their job, they're the bullies. So I do think there's such a thing as woke bullies. So with all this being said, I think it's fair to say that the term has become a bit meaningless. But what do we talk about instead? I mean, if I want to talk about excessive woke thinking, it's a bit hard to avoid the term because that's its usage. That's what, the left cannot complain about this. They cannot say, oh, the term is being misunderstood by right wingers. If they're refusing to look at the excesses of it, they can't just say this is all an invention, it's all something right wingers have made up. There is a problem. Um, so, in conclusion, I hope I've made my own position clear. I do not like the excesses of so-called woke thinking. I don't think it actually is awoken. I think it's a bit cheapish. I think it's a bit cult-like. That's the opposite of being awoken to something. That's actually being very closed-minded. If you're going to interpret an innocent question as some sort of sinister racist thing, I mean, really, I'll even use my own experience, for instance. I do get a little bit irritated when people say, for instance, oh, I like your accent. I was visited Ireland once. Now, I'm from Northern Ireland. I have that accent, but I've grown up in England. I've been here for 25 years. But what I'm not going to do is think, okay, there's some sort of, I might be irritated, but I might gently correct them, but I'm not going to run to the police and report a hate crime. That sort of stuff really is nonsense. And it does sometimes happen. Um, but there is something to be said for mutual respect. The other thing I don't like about the right, and some on the left as well, it's one thing being too politically correct, but there is also such a thing as just being crass and just being bombastic and just being a bore, a loudmouth bore. I mean, there are times you need to have a bit of subtlety and a bit of class, a bit of respect, frankly. So I mean, I wouldn't say, for instance, that someone making some really bad taste joke about, say, a terrorist attack, and then victims of that terrorist attack took issue with it. I would absolutely support the victims and saying, well, yeah, of course they're going to be. I just think that If you cannot communicate without being obnoxious, then that says a lot about your character. Um, and I notice a lot of Trump voters, a lot of Trump people, and I'm not a politician, so I can't say this. Um, Frankly, they just seem to revel in being unpleasant and nasty. They see it as strength. They see it as something to admire. It's two extremes. So yes, you get the left wing extremes that are overtly woke and just to the point of controlling, but you also get the other extreme, which is just obnoxious. Let's just have some reason, let's have some middle ground and just some degree of respect. I'm not saying people should all go in a circle and sing Kumbaya, but just have some basic respect. That's all. Just have passionate disagreements. But I think when it gets to the point of just, I was going to say name calling, sometimes adjectives are appropriately applied, but yeah, so from now on, I'm not going to say I'm never going to use this term again, but I'm going to reduce it because I do think it's somewhat lost meaning. But I would say to the left wing people, if you're sort of getting defensive about this, consider the excesses. If you're not calling out the excesses, you can't really complain about the right using the term in a negative way. And do not tell me that being woke is about being compassionate because the evidence shows otherwise. It shows being micromanaging, it shows it being excessively sensitive. Excuse me, I don't think it's got anything to do with compassion. So that's how I see it. Thanks for watching.